Sir, I need to see some ID. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area.
I'm sitting on a bench reading a book. What's suspicious about that?
Do you have identification or not?
I'm a psychiatrist at the hospital across the street. I eat lunch here every single day.
I don't care if you're the president. ID now.
Is it because I'm black?
The body camera was already recording when Dr. Malcolm Pierce looked up from his medical journal and realized this officer had no intention of walking away. What should have been a peaceful lunch break in Riverside Park was about to become a masterclass in implicit bias, constitutional law, and why some people never learn that a uniform doesn't make you untouchable. The officer had no idea he was talking to the lead forensic psychiatrist who evaluated police officers for psychological fitness, the same man who had failed 3 candidates from this exact precinct in the last 6 months. Before we continue, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. And please hit that subscribe button because what happens next is absolutely wild. You won't want to miss this. Dr. Malcolm Pierce was 52 years old, though most people guessed younger. He had the kind of face that smiled easily, the kind of presence that put patients at ease within minutes. He'd been a forensic psychiatrist for 23 years, specializing in law enforcement psychological evaluations. He assessed officers before they were hired. He evaluated them after critical incidents. He determined if they were psychologically fit to carry a weapon and enforce the law. He was good at his job, really good. So good that 3 different police departments in the city contracted his services. He had evaluated over 2,000 officers during his career. He could spot personality disorders, rage issues, racial bias, and authority complexes within the first 20 minutes of an interview. His reports were detailed, evidence-based, and often unwelcome because Malcolm Pierce didn't rubber stamp evaluations. If an officer showed signs of being psychologically unfit, Pierce documented it thoroughly and recommended against their hiring or reinstatement. Some departments loved him for his integrity, some departments hated him for the same reason. On this particular Wednesday afternoon in September, Malcolm was sitting on his favorite bench in Riverside Park, eating a turkey sandwich and reading the latest issue of the Journal of Forensic Psychology. He had been doing this almost every workday for the past 8 years. Same bench, same routine, same peaceful hour away from the intensity of evaluating people's mental states. The park was beautiful this time of year. Trees just starting to turn colors, a slight breeze coming off the river, families with small children feeding ducks near the pond, joggers on the path, dog walkers, the normal rhythm of city park life. Malcolm was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, his hospital ID badge clipped to his belt. His lunch bag sat next to him on the bench. His phone was in his pocket. He was doing absolutely nothing that could be considered suspicious, unless you counted reading medical journals as inherently threatening. That's when Officer Nolan Prescott walked up. Nolan Prescott was 29 years old, 5 years into his career with the Metropolitan Police Department. He had decent arrest numbers. He had never been involved in a shooting. His file was clean except for 2 citizen complaints about rudeness, both of which had been dismissed after cursory investigation. What his file didn't show was the pattern, the way he seemed to find reasons to stop and question black men in this particular park, the way his traffic stops skewed heavily toward minority drivers, the way he wrote reports that always seemed to emphasize furtive movements and suspicious behavior when describing people of color. Nobody had looked closely enough to connect those dots yet, but they would. Prescott had been walking his patrol route through the park when he spotted Malcolm on the bench. Later, Prescott would claim he was responding to reports of suspicious activity. The problem with that claim was simple. There had been no such reports. Dispatch logs would prove it. Prescott had seen a black man sitting alone on a bench and decided that was worth investigating. The conversation started exactly as described. Prescott demanded identification. Malcolm questioned why. Prescott insisted. Malcolm explained he was simply having lunch. But let's talk about how this conversation actually went, because the subtext was as important as the words. "Sir, I need to see some ID," Prescott said, his tone already carrying that edge of assumed authority. Not a request, a command. The kind of tone that says, "I'm in charge here and you're gonna do what I say." Malcolm looked up from his journal. He took in the officer's stance, the hand resting on the belt near the weapon, the body language that screamed confrontation. He'd seen this exact presentation hundreds of times in his evaluation sessions. Overcompensating authority, unnecessary aggression, classic signs of someone who used the badge to feel powerful. "I'm sitting on a bench reading a book," Malcolm said calmly. "What's suspicious about that?" The question was reasonable, neutral, non-confrontational, but Prescott heard it as challenge. "Just comply with my request," Prescott said, his voice harder now. "Do you have identification or not?" Notice the phrasing, not "can I see your ID" or Would you mind showing me identification? Just comply. As if Malcolm had already done something requiring compliance. As if the mere act of sitting while black was enough to trigger a lawful order. Malcolm set his journal down carefully. He'd been through enough evaluation sessions to know exactly what was happening here. This wasn't about suspicious activity. This was about an officer who saw someone who didn't fit his internal image of who belonged in this park. I'm a psychiatrist at the hospital across the street, Malcolm said, gesturing to the medical center visible through the trees. I eat lunch here every single day, have been for 8 years. It was a simple statement of fact, an explanation that should have ended the encounter. A reasonable person would have said, okay, enjoy your lunch, and walked away. Prescott wasn't being reasonable. That doesn't answer my question, he said. ID now. Have you ever been questioned by police for doing absolutely nothing wrong? Drop a comment and let me know. Malcolm could have shown his ID at this point. It was right there in his wallet. Hospital credentials, driver's license, even his consultant badge for the police department's psychological services division. He could have pulled it out, flashed it, ended the whole thing. But Malcolm Pierce hadn't spent 23 years evaluating police officers without learning something important. When you comply with unlawful orders, you validate them. You teach officers that they can demand compliance without cause. You reinforce the exact behavior that leads to rights violations. So he asked a different question. Officer, under what legal authority are you demanding my identification? Prescott's jaw tightened. Malcolm saw it immediately. That micro expression of frustration when someone doesn't just roll over. I don't have to explain myself to you, Prescott said. This is a lawful order. Failure to comply is obstruction. Actually, Malcolm said, his voice still calm, still professional. Under Hybel versus Nevada, you need reasonable suspicion of criminal activity to require identification. I'm sitting on a public bench during daylight hours. What specific articulable facts give you reasonable suspicion that I'm engaged in criminal activity? Prescott hadn't expected that. Most people he stopped didn't cite Supreme Court cases. Most people just handed over their ID and accepted whatever treatment they received. We've had reports of thefts in this area, Prescott said, changing tactics. I'm investigating. What was stolen? When? What's the report number? Silence. Because there was no report. There had been no thefts. Prescott was making it up as he went along, hoping Malcolm would just comply before the lie became obvious. Malcolm waited. He was very good at waiting. Years of sitting across from officers who were trying to hide psychological issues had taught him that silence was a powerful tool. People filled silence. They revealed themselves. Look, Prescott said, his tone shifting to something that was probably meant to sound reasonable. I'm just trying to do my job here. This park, you know, we get a lot of problems. I'm sure you understand. Just show me your ID and you can get back to your lunch. This park, we get a lot of problems. I'm sure you understand. The subtext was screaming. This park wasn't supposed to be for people like Malcolm. Problems meant people who looked like Malcolm. I'm sure you understand meant Malcolm should accept his place in the hierarchy and comply. Malcolm had heard this language 1,000 times. In evaluation sessions when officers tried to justify their actions, in incident reports that danced around explicit racism while soaking in it, in the careful phrasing that was meant to avoid liability while still expressing bias. He was tired of it. Officer, I'm going to explain something to you, Malcolm said. You approached me without probable cause. You demanded identification without reasonable suspicion. You've now claimed there are theft reports that I'm certain don't exist. You're violating my Fourth Amendment rights, and you're doing it because you made an assumption about me based on how I look. Prescott's face flushed. This has nothing to do with what? Malcolm asked quietly. What were you about to say? Prescott stopped himself. But they both knew what he had almost said. This has nothing to do with race. The denial that every officer makes when they're caught profiling, the reflexive defense that proves they know exactly what they're doing. What's your badge number? Malcolm asked. You don't need my badge number. You're not being detained. Am I free to go? The question hung in the air. It was the magic question, the one that forced officers to make a choice. Either I'm being detained, which requires reasonable suspicion, or I'm free to go, which means this encounter is voluntary and I can end it. Prescott couldn't answer. If he said yes, Malcolm would leave and the officer would lose face. If he said no, he'd have to articulate legal grounds for detention that he didn't have. I'm asking you to voluntarily provide identification, Prescott finally said. And I'm declining your request, Malcolm responded. Am I free to go or am I being detained? Sir, you're being difficult. No, officer, I'm asserting my constitutional rights. There's a difference. Now, am I free to go? Prescott's hand moved toward his radio. Malcolm saw it and understood immediately what was about to happen. Prescott was going to call for backup. He was going to escalate because his ego couldn't handle being challenged. "Before you call for backup," Malcolm said, "you should know that I'm Dr. Malcolm Pierce. I'm the forensic psychiatrist who conducts psychological evaluations for the Metropolitan Police Department. I evaluate officers for fitness for duty. I've personally evaluated probably 100 officers from your precinct, and everything that's happening right now is going into a report that your superiors are going to see." Prescott froze. His hand hovered over the radio. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, fear, anger, denial. "I don't believe you," he finally said. Malcolm reached slowly into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card. He held it up where Prescott could see it. "Dr. Malcolm Pierce, MD, Forensic Psychiatry, Police Psychological Services Consultant, Metropolitan Police Department." Prescott stared at the card. You could see his mind working, trying to figure out if this was real, trying to calculate how much trouble he was in. "You can call the department's Psychological Services office," Malcolm said. "Ask for me. They'll confirm. Or you can check your own precinct's files. I evaluated 3 candidates from your station in the last 6 months alone. Failed all 3 for psychological unfitness. Type karma if you think this officer just learned a hard lesson." The silence stretched out. Other people in the park had started to notice the encounter. A woman with a stroller had stopped on the path, watching. 2 teenagers on bikes had slowed down to see what was happening. An older man walking his dog was standing about 20 feet away, clearly listening. Prescott was aware of the audience, aware that he had just confronted his department's psychological evaluator, aware that everything he'd said and done in the last several minutes was probably going to end up in a file somewhere. "I was just doing my job," Prescott said quietly. "No," Malcolm corrected him. "You were violating my rights because you made assumptions about who belongs in this park. That's not your job. That's bias, and it's exactly the kind of behavior that should disqualify someone from law enforcement. I didn't. It wasn't about—" Prescott stopped again. Every sentence he tried to construct just made it worse. Malcolm stood up. He gathered his lunch bag and his journal. He looked Prescott directly in the eye. "Badge number, name, station. I'm filing a formal complaint, and I'm documenting this encounter in my professional capacity as a police psychologist. You violated my rights. You demonstrated clear signs of implicit bias, and you attempted to use your authority to cover for the fact that you had no legal basis for this stop." Prescott gave him the information. "Badge 5439, Officer Nolan Prescott, 12th Precinct." Malcolm wrote it down in the margin of his journal. Then he walked away. The whole encounter had lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes that would end Nolan Prescott's law enforcement career. Malcolm didn't wait until he got back to his office. He sat down on another bench, out of sight of Prescott, and called the Metropolitan Police Department's Internal Affairs Division directly. He knew the number by heart. He'd called it before when he'd observed officer misconduct. "This is Dr. Malcolm Pierce," he said when someone answered. "I need to file a formal complaint about an officer who just violated my 4th Amendment rights in Riverside Park." "Yes, I'll hold." The complaint process was smooth because Malcolm knew exactly what information to provide. Date, time, location, badge number, specific actions taken, specific constitutional violations, witness information. He provided it all in clear, professional language. The kind of language that made it impossible to dismiss. The internal affairs detective who took the call knew Malcolm. They'd worked together on several officer evaluations. When Malcolm explained what had happened, there was a long pause. "He stopped you?" the detective asked. "You specifically?" "He stopped me specifically," Malcolm confirmed. "And based on the encounter, I have serious concerns about his psychological fitness for duty. I'm recommending a full evaluation. I'll initiate the investigation immediately." Malcolm went back to work that afternoon. He had 3 evaluation sessions scheduled. Ironically, none of them were from the 12th Precinct, but Malcolm made a note to review his files on any officers from that station. If Prescott was operating this way, there might be a cultural problem in that precinct. The internal affairs investigation started that same afternoon. The detective pulled Prescott's body camera footage first. The camera had captured the entire encounter in perfect detail. Malcolm's calm questions, Prescott's aggressive demands, the changing justifications, the implicit bias in every word and gesture. Then the detective did what Malcolm had suspected someone would eventually do, pulled Prescott's stop data. In 5 years, Prescott had made 1,247 stops. Of those, 892 were of people of color. That was 71.5% of his stops. In a city where the demographic breakdown was approximately 42% people of color, Prescott was stopping minority citizens at nearly double the rate that demographics would predict. The detective dug deeper. Of the 892 stops of people of color, only 198 resulted in arrests or citations. That's a 22% rate. Of the 355 stops of white citizens, 267 resulted in arrests or citations. That's a 75% rate. The pattern was identical to what investigators find in every profiling case. Stop minorities frequently, usually without finding anything. Stop white citizens less frequently, usually when there's actual cause. Prescott was called in for an interview on day 3 of the investigation. He was told to bring his union representative. He knew that was a bad sign. The interview lasted 90 minutes. The detective walked Prescott through the encounter step by step. Why did you approach Dr. Pierce? He looked out of place. Out of place how? I don't know. Just didn't seem like he belonged there. In a public park? It's a nice area we don't usually see. Prescott couldn't finish the sentence without explicitly revealing his bias, so he stopped. You don't usually see what, Officer Prescott? Silence. Let me ask you directly. Did you approach Dr. Pierce because he's black? No, I didn't. It's not about. I just thought. The interview transcript would later show 17 separate instances where Prescott started sentences he couldn't finish. Every one of them was a moment where he nearly admitted racial bias before catching himself. Do you think officers like this should be removed from the force? Let me know in the comments. The detective showed Prescott the stop data, the numbers, the patterns, the statistical evidence of bias. Can you explain this disparity? The detective asked. Prescott tried. He talked about high crime areas. He talked about suspicious behavior patterns. He talked about his training and instincts. None of it explained why he stopped people of color at double the rate and found violations at a quarter of the rate. The evidence was overwhelming. Prescott had profiled Dr. Pierce. He had done it based on race. He had violated constitutional rights, and the data showed it wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that had persisted for 5 years without anyone noticing or caring enough to investigate. On day 12 of the investigation, Malcolm submitted his professional evaluation. It was a 16-page document that detailed the psychological indicators Prescott had displayed during their encounter. Authoritarian personality traits, inability to acknowledge mistakes, defensive reactions to legitimate questions, implicit bias manifesting in decision-making, poor judgment, excessive concern with maintaining dominance, lack of self-awareness regarding prejudices. The evaluation concluded with a clear recommendation. Officer Nolan Prescott was psychologically unfit for duty and should not be carrying a badge or weapon. It was the kind of evaluation that ended careers, and Malcolm had the professional standing to make it stick. The Metropolitan Police Department's leadership reviewed everything: the body camera footage, the stop data, the internal affairs report, Malcolm's psychological evaluation, the pattern of complaints that had been dismissed without proper investigation. They had several options. They could give Prescott additional training, they could reassign him, they could suspend him and hope it blew over, or they could actually hold him accountable. For once, they chose accountability. Officer Nolan Prescott was terminated on day 28 of the investigation. The termination letter cited multiple policy violations, pattern of discriminatory behavior, violation of constitutional rights, and psychological unfitness for duty per the evaluation of the department's consulting psychiatrist. Prescott appealed. His union fought hard. They argued that Prescott had made a mistake, that he deserved another chance, that termination was too harsh. The appeals board reviewed all the evidence. Then they asked Prescott's union representative one question. If we reinstate this officer and he violates someone's rights again, are you prepared for the department to be sued for millions because we ignored clear evidence of a pattern? The union representative couldn't answer that question the way Prescott needed him to. The termination was upheld, but Malcolm wasn't done, because the encounter in the park wasn't just about Prescott. It was about a system that had allowed Prescott to operate this way for 5 years. Malcolm filed a formal complaint with the city's Civilian Complaint Review Board, not about Prescott specifically, but about the 12th Precinct's failure to identify and address the pattern, about the superficial investigations into previous complaints, about the lack of oversight that had let Prescott's bias go unchecked. The review board launched their own investigation. They pulled data on every officer in the 12th Precinct, they looked at stop patterns, they reviewed complaint files, they interviewed community members. What they found was disturbing. Prescott wasn't an outlier. He was the norm. The entire precinct showed statistical evidence of biased policing. Stop rates were skewed. Arrest rates showed disparities. Use of force incidents were concentrated in minority neighborhoods. The precinct had a culture problem, and Prescott was just a symptom. The review board issued a scathing report. They called for the precinct commander to be replaced. They demanded new training protocols. They required independent monitoring of all stops. They mandated data collection and quarterly reporting. The police union called it an overreach. The community called it long overdue. The city council, facing pressure from civil rights organizations and the threat of federal intervention, sided with the review board. The reforms were implemented over the next 6 months. Some officers resigned rather than work under the new scrutiny. Some adjusted their behavior. Some kept doing what they'd always done and found themselves facing discipline for the first time in their careers. Type finally if you think these changes were necessary. Malcolm continued his work as a forensic psychiatrist. His encounter with Prescott became a case study he used when training new evaluators. He showed the body camera footage in presentations about implicit bias and officer psychology. He continued eating lunch in Riverside Park. Same bench, same routine. But now, when officers walked by on patrol, they nodded politely and kept walking. Word had gotten around about what had happened. Nobody wanted to be the next Officer Prescott. The lawsuit came later. Malcolm filed a federal civil rights complaint 6 months after the termination. His wife had been hesitant at first. "Do we really need to go through all this?" she'd asked. But Malcolm was firm. This wasn't optional. The complaint alleged violation of Fourth Amendment rights, racial profiling, failure to train and supervise, and creation of a culture that tolerated discriminatory policing. The city's lawyers looked at the evidence. They looked at Prescott's termination. They looked at the review board's findings. They looked at the statistical data. They looked at Malcolm's credentials and his role as a police psychologist. They settled quickly. The terms included a payment to Malcolm of $680,000 and an agreement that the city would implement additional reforms beyond what the review board had already required. Malcolm kept the money. He and his wife had been talking about retiring early, maybe buying a small place near the coast. The settlement made that possible. Some people criticized this, saying he should have donated it to charity or refused the payment on principle. But Malcolm had a different view. "I was violated," he told a colleague who asked. "My rights were trampled because of the color of my skin." That has value. The city needs to feel the financial consequences of allowing officers like Prescott to operate. If I refuse the money, I'm telling them violations are free. He used part of the settlement to set up a college fund for his nieces. Another portion went toward the down payment on that coastal property. The rest went into retirement savings. It was his money. He'd earned it by standing up for his rights when it would have been easier to show his ID and move on. Officer Nolan Prescott never worked in law enforcement again. He tried to get hired at other departments, but the termination for cause and the psychological unfitness determination made it impossible. Most departments ran background checks. Most departments saw the red flags. He found work in private security for a while, but even that didn't last. His bias issues followed him. Complaints from clients. Incidents where his judgment was questioned. He eventually left security work entirely. In later interviews, Prescott would claim he was railroaded, that the department had thrown him under the bus, that the system had become too politically correct. He never acknowledged his pattern of stops. He never admitted his bias. He never took responsibility for violating Malcolm's rights. Some people never learn. The 12th Precinct underwent significant changes. New leadership, new training, new accountability measures. The stop data over the next 2 years showed improvement. Not perfection, but movement in the right direction. Other precincts across the city implemented similar reforms, some voluntarily, others after their own investigations revealed similar patterns. The body camera footage of the encounter was never released publicly per the settlement agreement, but it was used extensively in police training. New recruits watched it as an example of what not to do. Supervisors used it to train officers on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. Law enforcement psychology programs across the country added the case to their curriculum. It became a textbook example of how bias manifests in policing and why psychological screening is critical. Malcolm gave occasional talks at police academies and universities. He always told the same story: the park bench, the unlawful stop, the officer who couldn't articulate reasonable suspicion because there was none. He emphasized that this wasn't about one bad officer. It was about systems that allowed bad officers to operate unchecked, about departments that dismiss complaints without real investigation, about a culture that valued loyalty over accountability. And he always ended with the same message: rights only matter if people are willing to assert them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when there's a badge involved, even when compliance would be easier. The park bench where it all happened is still there. People sit on it every day, completely unaware that it was the site of an encounter that changed department policy, ended a career, and became a case study in police reform. Malcolm still eats lunch there sometimes, though not every day anymore. When he does, he thinks about that September afternoon, about the officer who made assumptions, about the 8 minutes that proved knowledge and professional credentials could force accountability. He thinks about all the people who get stopped without calls and don't have his advantages, don't have his credentials, don't have his knowledge of the law and the system, don't have the professional standing to make complaints stick. That's why he did what he did, not just for himself, but for all the others who couldn't fight back as effectively, to create a precedent, to force change, to show that accountability was possible if enough pressure was applied. One man, one park bench, one 8-minute encounter, one career ended, one department reformed. That's the power of refusing to accept the unacceptable. What would you have done in Malcolm's situation? Would you have shown your ID and ended it, or stood your ground like he did? Drop a comment and let me know what you think. And if this story taught you something or opened your eyes to how profiling actually works, hit that subscribe button. I share these stories because they matter, because they show that change is possible, because they remind us that accountability isn't automatic. It has to be demanded. Thanks for watching all the way through. See you in the next one.